every tool that, got it, including this flood of federal money, that there is world-class basic data infrastructure that is cheap, shared, and ubiquitous, reaching every home and business. Second, here's the second message, that basic infrastructure has to be multi-purpose. It has to help Maine reach its energy goals, its emission goals, lowering energy use, as well as getting information and communication everywhere. And it should be shared at the retail level by a host of private sector and public actors who actually sell services to people. The image here is a publicly overseen road over which a bunch of different vehicles travel. And third, all of this is going to require extraordinarily competent government involvement that is laser focused on preserving what makes Maine great and a place where people want to live as well as visit in the future, as the governor said. The shenanigans we've seen recently in Leeds and Hampton are wake-up calls. Mainers should not have to rely on the courage of volunteers to have the basic service of cheap, world-class data in their homes. So back to cognitive biases. We're human. We don't really deep down believe that the way things are is actually going to change, much less change very quickly. But the Bay of Fundy is changing, the fish and the lobster are leaving. I want to remind all of us that we are radically underestimating the extraordinary slope of those changes. We're all suffering from what's called hindsight bias. So there's a dry hurricane season or a regular spring, and we all see those beneficial past events as predictable. We believe as humans, by contrast, that bad events are not predictable. So something like Hurricane Sandy in New York City and Boston is explained inside ourselves as unpredictable, as anomalous. We couldn't have planned for it. But that's like telling a teacher the dog ate my homework. Based on everything I'm studying, rapidly accelerating climate change will, within 2 decades or so, force tens of millions of Americans to migrate. It's obvious, unless you're operating with hindsight bias. We are really in for it as a country. And Maine is in for it too. No one is moving fast enough on this front. Here's the link to COVID. You saw a huge influx of migrants after the pandemic began. So you already know that Maine is going to be a place where more people will want to move to get away from coastal flooding, extreme heat, horrifying wildfires. You'll be a receiving state. And maybe you don't want that, but it is going to happen, and you could plan ahead for it in ways that keep Maine Maine. A big part of this planning ahead is internet access. Many Mainers, not you, but many others, maybe don't think of having world-class internet access as normal or maybe even desirable. And they don't think any level of government should have anything to do with it. And I get it. In the 1960s, people were rolling electric demonstration kitchens around the Irish countryside to convince people that having electricity in their homes made sense. And in this country, we saw exactly the same industry-funded fights over public involvement in electricity 100 years ago that we're seeing this month in Hampton and Leeds. But people moving to Maine, or your children that stay there, will expect cheap, ubiquitous, never have to think about it, internet access. They'll need it, as the governor said, to get to healthcare and educate their children. It will be normalized, or it should be, just like electricity. You wouldn't think of a non-electrified house as normal. We shouldn't think of high-priced, second-rate service from a company that can charge whatever it wants as normal. To cope with the changes, to plan ahead, the state right now has the opportunity to make long-term, clear-eyed plans for multi-purpose, shared, basic infrastructure that goes everywhere. My second point really is about multi-purpose. It needs to be used for energy as well as communications, to load balance energy sources, to get more renewables coming into the grid, to time when and where energy use is most appropriate. On the data side, it needs to be used to allow people to work where they live rather than live where they work, as the governor said. It needs to be allowed for genuine presence at a distance for health services and education. We learned that from COVID. As much as possible, it needs to be shared at every level to avoid choke points that can be used to squeeze citizens and companies. And at the lowest levels, the level of dirt and conduit, it has to be publicly overseen and controlled. Then on top of that, there can be all kinds of private and public services running, again, just like a highway. Only with public oversight and ownership at these lowest levels can Maine serve its values, unleashing the private marketplace, ensuring that utilities and other entities keep their prices low and their service levels high, lowering emissions, and ensuring universal, sensible, never have to think about it service to everyone in the state. So those are my first 2 points: world-class infrastructure in more places, as the governor said, and infrastructure that is shared and multi-purpose so that it serves public values while simultaneously providing more opportunities for the private sector. And now comes my third and final point: competent government involvement. It's a good thing, I think, that Andrew Butcher has 5 older sisters. In his new role, he can bridge different interests, create a wealth of partnerships and opportunities, and build on what already exists and be a great communicator to the public. He and the rest of the state leadership will have to be truly competent, managing very complex processes, demanding adequate resources, standing up first-rate management, helping every village and town in the state, making decisions and navigating the political consequences of those decisions in a way the public supports, and explaining why government involvement is essential over and over again. Some of those necessarily brutally clear-headed decisions will be just like the ones well-run cities make, except on a state level. Need to draw lines to ensure open space is preserved. You're already losing a ton of farmland to development each year. Constrain and focusing growth, making sure increased density is where you want it and sprawl is avoided. Strengthening land use regulation, planning for public transit, avoiding fragmented jurisdictional fights, and ensuring that there's revenue streams that are firmly attached to all the basic government services. Things like streets, electric, water, flood protection, this basic communications, electric infrastructure. So everyone gets a high level of service. It's that last part that is hard for Americans to take in, but I bet your state can do it. There has to be a basic level of normal service for everyone that is well-resourced, where the desired output of government services is matched to the revenue that supports them, while public policy goals, Maine's values, are met at the same time. Overall Mainers, those costs are minuscule, but they are costs. Otherwise, Maine will end up just muddling through. And what happens with muddling through is that some people get treated in genuinely unfair ways, particularly poor people, rural people, older people. This is always true, always predictable, and certainly a lesson we learned from COVID. So that's it. Those are my remarks. Just 3 ideas. Maine needs to ensure there's world-class basic data infrastructure that is cheap, shared, and ubiquitous, reaching every home and business. The Maine Connectivity Authority needs to serve as a clearinghouse for information, rules, guidance, funding. It's a big task, all focused in this direction. Second, that basic infrastructure, as much as possible, has to be multi-purpose and shared. And third, those first 2 moves will require extraordinarily competent government involvement. The good news is you do this right and trust in government is enhanced. Here's another cognitive bias. Too many of us talking here have internalized a planning horizon of 1 or 2 decades, whether we admit it or not. That's the time people like me personally have left on Earth, if we're lucky. But Maine right now urgently needs to look far ahead. Thank you so much for having me.
There's a lot there. Thank you so much, Susan. A lot to dig into, and we'll turn it right over to Karim and Joe to get into it.
Susan, thanks so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you and be part of the conversation. Thank you sincerely on behalf of the entire state of Maine that you're participating here. Just to kick off the conversation a little bit, one of my thoughts is that, we're on this tectonic landscape of public monies, public assets, and public benefit. From where you are, how do you see the telecommunications industry evolve in the next 30 years as a function of public benefit and private expertise?
Well, thanks, Karim. It's great to see you and lovely to be here. I have to say, you have a very special moment right now because, yes, you're right. All the money's coming in, the plates are shifting, but you've got a governor who gets it. You've got this new, fragile, new entity that's going to help pull together money and guide people. You're pulling yourselves together. What I'm really talking about today is thinking about long-term planning and not just leaving everything to a patchwork of these earnest volunteers across the state. That feels so painful to me and unnecessary given these other attributes you have. So I really do see the future as this, it's so sensible, shared, basic, great infrastructure everywhere that lowers costs, lets the private sector flourish, but it has to be coupled with a lot of planning for where Maine goes in the future.
I'll jump in. Susan, First, nice to meet you virtually, and thank you also for joining all of us today. I have I guess, a sort of pragmatic initial question, and that's we're in a state with some real population density challenges, terrain challenges, et cetera. So given that, and as the author of a book entitled Fiber, what are your thoughts on hybrid networks that combine fiber with other technologies like wireless in terms of meeting not only our needs over the next decade, but as you say, that longer term planning horizon? So what are your thoughts on those types of networks?
I would love us to have real vision in Maine. I've spent a lot of time in two countries that have about the same density as we do in America and have a lot of empty land and a lot of challenges. And they have said that the essential network is fiber. It just is. And if you can run it to as close to houses as you can, that's the point. And then certainly all of us are using Wi-Fi in our homes, and wireless is like the end of a shower head. You know, the water gets as close as possible and then comes to you through that spray of wireless devices. But to say to a rural community, you get wireless and everybody else gets a fiber to the home seems to me not to be meeting this basic level of service. It's just like with electricity. We don't say to people in rural areas, you get less electricity than the people, or you can turn on fewer lights or whatever it is, than the people who live in denser areas. It's just a matter of will and planning. In the interim, I do get that you get these wires as close as you can to homes, and then you take wireless for the next bit, and then you wait until you have more money. I just don't want to have that be the final vision for what life in a rural area is like, because that's not true in Korea, and it's not true in Sweden. It's not true in a host of Northern European countries. And why should Americans be left behind, and especially rural Americans? We know there are lots of bright people with bright futures, and they should not be treated as second-class citizens.
So Susan, speaking about Europe and the rest of the world, how do you see from a policy-making point of view the intersection of data privacy rights like GDPR in Europe and net neutrality, let's call it trending in terms of policy under the Biden administration and the new FCC commissioner? How do you see those two things intersecting so that the infrastructure that is built is ubiquitous, is accessible, is affordable, and also resilient and reliant? How do you see those two things mesh together for the consumer? These are pro-consumer things that matter for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, net neutrality and data privacy rights.
Absolutely. Actually, my vision for this government involvement at the very basic level of the network means that there will be competition among providers to provide better consumer protections. If you're just stuck with one provider, they can do whatever they want. That's the situation we have in America. And this is one reason why I'm not as much of a fan of having cities themselves offer the service, that it actually is better for the private marketplace to do that so that they compete on these elements. I think that the United States is eventually going to drift into harmony with the European view of privacy. Net neutrality is actually a symptom of a broken marketplace, that because we have such concentration, because it is in the interest of a vertically integrated provider who has its own content to pervert that content. It's not evil, it's just in their interest. That we've sort of made up this synthetic issue of net neutrality to stand in for what we had in the past, which was an entire regulatory regime saying you can't use this data for marketing purposes or for selling your own services. So we got rid of all that. We deregulated the whole sector. The way I see we move forward is to say, here's a public work that is the basic infrastructure. Private companies, you compete on top of it, and you're going to be marketing your privacy sensitive services to consumers as an attribute of what you're up to.
Right.
And if the government is itself providing the service, there is always in the back of some people's minds the concern that subpoena will go to that government actor, or just the chief of police will walk over and collect all the data of who's been doing what on that network. And so it's a concern. It's in the back of people's minds. And I like to just eliminate that as a concern in building these networks.
Yeah.
So, Susan, I'm going to return us back to the sort of the concerns of how do we build this out? And that's, many communities in Maine, many of the people on today's session have within the last 12 or 18 months become very involved in trying to plan for broadband expansion. And we're seeing that happen in every state across the country. We're also seeing this huge influx of federal funds and some state funds, which are very welcome, of course. The problem is that causes a supply and demand issue. And I think we're seeing that now. It's a little bit compounded with the COVID situation. But one of the fears that I think many of the people on this today's session have is that some of the planning we're doing is going to be made with data and pricing and things that affected us maybe a couple of years ago and are not going to hold true. So do you have any thoughts on how essentially the supply and demand, this influx of dollars, is going to essentially increase the pricing and decrease the availability of the very resources we need to build these networks out?
Joe, that's a really important question and a tough one. I think these networks, as you know, are really a matter of economies of scale, and the buying power of all the communities put together would keep prices low. It's the problem with one struggling community having to go it alone, where they run into both delays from all kinds of forces and perhaps rising costs of the hard stuff needed to build the network. This is another place where the Connectivity Authority could play a role, but I'm not sure the timing's going to work out. If it was in place and strong enough to help aggregate demand and require particular pricing and availability of resources, that would really help. That would really help if it was viewed as an honest broker steward of those desires, so that local communities were not competing for resources among themselves, but rather felt confident that there would be enough money and time and resources to build those networks. So that aggregation role is really important in this business. It's all about money and numbers of people who take up the service, how you can lower your per customer cost. And we do this at the federal level. We lower the cost of, say, health insurance by bidding as a giant government to get those contracts. Here too, that is an important role of the state authority to perhaps keep those prices down. But if it's not ready in time to help with that, at least I would hope for collaboration on a regional level, so that, again, you're not competing against each other for resources, but rather joining in numbers to be more powerful as a demander of services. Yeah. It's hard.
Speaking of hard, what are the best practices that communities, the state, Andrew and the entire board, us as a private sector and members of communities use for inclusion, right? So the history is rife with redlining. The history is rife with cherry picking and in creating, affectionately known as donuts, these areas where there's no service or little to viable future service, right? So how do communities create the best practices and deploy those best practices? So low-income neighborhoods, BIPOC communities, immigrant communities, tribal lands, everybody is part and parcel of the infrastructure. How do we get everybody to understand that this is an elemental human right for everybody? What are best practices you have seen, Susan, over the United States, in the world, where inclusion is part and parcel of that anchor?
Well, actually, this dividing line between public and private interests is where this lies. We as a country, at every level of government, are a government for everyone, not just for particular people. And we provide water, electricity for everyone, not just for particular people. This is why the involvement of government at the basic level, certainly dirt and conduit and perhaps dark fiber, is so important to make sure that it is reaching everyone. We don't have to argue with people about electricity. I think everybody understands it's needed. As if you make sure the cost is low, which you can do through these shared networks, and it's available easily. I'll give you an example. Northern European countries plan for immigrant communities to arrive by building transit and connection and energy networks in advance of their arrival. It's just basic stuff. And then it's just there. And you help them onto it with, I guess, digital literacy is sometimes needed still in this country. But the younger kids don't need that so much. This is just a matter of time for everybody to be enthusiastic about having these services if they're available at a reasonable cost. Because it's treated as a luxury, it feels difficult to bring people on. But I'll tell you, there are communities in the United States who in public housing units provide fiber connections for $10 a month. And if you can't afford that, they'll give you another subsidy. You can buy it per day, at the right price point, and perhaps a subsidized price point for the people of lower income. Everybody takes it because their kids want it.
Right. Right.
I see there are really interesting questions in the chat, and every once in a while I look down to them and I get a little distracted. We don't want to ignore people there, but I haven't been responding. Sorry about that.
Susan, if I could then, I see the couple of the questions as well in the chat, and I have one that I think brings some of those together, if I may.
Good.
And that's, as many of us on today's session are engaged in planning efforts, volunteer efforts for fairly small communities. Most communities in Maine are fairly small. In our area, we brought 5 local towns together as a coalition of volunteers and trying to band together. And I have some of my friends that are on the board on here today, I see. One of the problems that we've had, I think many people here today are having, is just an extraordinarily great difficulty in gaining clarity of information. And we've got certainly Peggy and Andrew and Tim and others, Kendra Jo, helping us, but it has been, we found it incredibly difficult to even understand when funds are going to be available, how to apply for those funds, what we need to do to get ready to apply for those funds. So certainly there's a role for ConnectMe, for others to help there. Can you offer any other advice on how we can essentially get smarter and more capable as we try to, frankly, compete for these funds?
The information asymmetries here are crushing. There's a spray of efforts going on at the federal level, state level. How are you possibly going to access that sitting in a small town? I'm really sympathetic. I think, again, sorry to dump on Andrew here, but this is another role for the new authority. They've got money to hire talent. They've got money to be following all that stuff every day and giving you deadlines and telling you what's happening. And they've also got some authority to bring, as you've done, bring groups together regionally to make this simpler. So I think overcoming those information asymmetries is going to require technical assistance. That's the word for it in other contexts, given to volunteers and others who are trying to get over this. That every community should have money and resources and staff dedicated to it to allow it to plan. But again, I know you've got lots of fractured independent efforts going on, and I think that's because there's been a vacuum. It would actually, it's sort of too bad we have to do it by ourselves. It would be better if there was a higher level planning effort that was moving really swiftly and fairly and viewed as good at it. And that's what I'm hoping that the Maine Connectivity Authority will be, to not only help those existing grassroots efforts, but also make the whole thing much more professional and trusted at a government level.
Right.
So Susan, would you then, from your analysis, suggest that the minimum broadband requirement should be a gigabit by gigabit then? If we're building stuff for the next 2, 3, 4 generations, why do we traditionally then have these conversations about whether 25 by 3, 50 by 10, 100 by 20, 100 by 100? What is your analysis of that conversation? Why can we not just say it's gigabit by gigabit for the next 30, 40 years?
I'm going to resist giving numbers that to some Mainers will sound interplanetary, and rather talk about this as a public work with fiber as the world-class medium, right? And also talk about the importance of symmetry. Everybody gets that everybody's download was at one point somebody else's upload. And a teleconference or having 3 people educating their kids at home requires symmetric access. That really the problem for Mainers is delay. You shouldn't have to wait. You shouldn't have to think about internet access. It should just disappear. And so we need the medium and the capacity that allows this to disappear into the backs of your minds. You and I know that's probably a gigabit at the very, very least, as Senator King has said in his work on this. It's 100 symmetrical. But let's get the right thing in place. And for the next several decades, That is fiber attached to high-speed wireless interconnection points. We know that.
Yeah.
And that's not going to go out of date. You're going to update the electronics at the end, and you don't have to dig it up. Once the glass is in the ground, it is ready to go for decades. And the stuff we put in the 70s and 80s is still in service.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's some flash in the pan technology. Let's get that there. And I resist talking about speeds that people argue over.
Great.
So I'm going to jump in, just keeping an eye on time. Susan, thank you so much. This was amazing. And clearly we could have talked to you all day. So now we need to keep you engaged. There are a lot of wonderful questions in the chat, and we will work with you to help answer some of those, or as many of them as we can,
Sure.
and include that with the follow-up from the video, and everything that comes out to folks afterwards. And thank you, Joe and Karem, for leading really a lively conversation and a great way to kick off our day. And Susan, we're not letting you go away. We're just keeping you for another session today, and then hopefully we keep you engaged in Maine for the long term.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.